Lesson 70, Indirect Discourse, Caesar, Book 1, Chapter 11, begun. Hi everybody, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today we're on page 208, and again that's Lesson 70. As you may have heard me mention, at this stage in the book we're doing lots of review as we go into the home stretch, including this lesson. There are only 4 lessons left in the book, and therefore in the lecture series. And so in this lesson, we're doing a big review of indirect discourse. We've talked about it many times, but it still bears repeating because it's such an integral part of the way the Latin language expresses itself. And furthermore, for those of you who are listening to this recording, you're probably self-taught or homeschooled, and so having someone explain it to you again may be very helpful. So going through this again won't hurt us at all. So let's jump into section 547. We're talking here about the difference between direct and indirect discourse. It says here, if we say, "The man is brave," we make a direct statement. If we say, "He knows the man to be brave," or "he said that the man was brave," the words following knows and said form indirect statements. And they go on to say that this kind of statement is based on verbs of saying, thinking, knowing. You can broadly define that kind of verb as verbs of the head or heart. All those verbs and other verbs like them can launch you off into indirect discourse or indirect statement. And so to help you get a picture of why it's called indirect statement, let's have a thought exercise. Let's imagine a scenario in which you are at a busy restaurant with your 2 friends, Fred and Sheila. You are all seated at a table facing the same way. Sheila is on the left, then Fred, and then you. So Fred is sitting between you and Sheila. Sheila says the statement, "My soup is cold." When she says this statement, that is a direct statement. Fred hears the statement that Sheila is saying, but you do not because you're sitting 2 people down from her, and the restaurant is noisy. So you say to Fred, "What did she say?" And then Fred repeats to you, "She says that her soup is cold." So Sheila is the originator of the message. She's the one that said it to begin with. When she said it and Fred heard it, it was a direct statement. But now it's being repeated to you in a second-hand kind of fashion. Now, Sheila is the originator of the message. Fred is an intermediary who is repeating the message. And then you are the final recipient of the message. In this fashion, the message is going indirectly from Sheila to you. When Fred says to you, "She says that her soup is cold," when he says that message, he is repeating it to you in a second-hand fashion, telling you what someone else said. So in that way, it's an indirect rendering of the message. So he'll start out his sentence with, "She says," and then he'll put in the word "that," and then he'll say, "Her soup is cold." That part of the sentence is called indirect statement or indirect discourse because it's being transmitted to you indirectly. The originator is Sheila, you are the final recipient, but Fred is an intermediary who is transmitting the message. Therefore, the message travels to you indirectly. That's why it's called indirect discourse. If you all were speaking Latin and Fred were telling you this in Latin, he would put the word soup in the accusative, and it would be a subject accusative. And then the word for is, he would make an infinitive. And so literally, he would say, "She says her soup to be cold." Indirect discourse in Latin has a subject accusative plus infinitive structure. And we do this occasionally in English too. In fact, here in section 547, they have an example. At the end of line 2, they say, If we say, he knows the man to be brave, that's very similar to Latin syntax. In English, he is nominative and she is nominative, while him and her are accusative. So if I say something like, I think him to be a fine young man, or I think her to be a fine young lady, those statements sound a bit archaic, but they still are perfectly good English, and they have the same kind of syntax as you would find in a corresponding Latin sentence. So whether it's Latin or English, we can still do that same subject-accusative plus infinitive kind of construction. If I say, I think him to be a fine young man, the word him is a subject-accusative, and then to be is an infinitive. I think her to be a fine young woman. The word her is a subject-accusative. It's not nominative. It's accusative. And then to be is an infinitive. So that accusative plus infinitive kind of construction is what comprises the indirect part of the sentence, the part that's being transmitted indirectly from the originator of the message to its final recipient. And this can happen with all kinds of verbs of feeling, thinking, knowing. In our readings from Caesar's Gallic Wars, we'll see it starting with verbs such as puto, which means to think. Also, facio certiorem, I make more certain, which is an idiom that means to inform. And even verbs of reporting, like reporto, they report that, blah, blah, blah. So lots of different kinds of verbs of saying or communicating can initiate indirect statement. In Latin, oftentimes when you have indirect statement, the infinitive within the indirect statement is comprised of a participle plus the word esse. So you have a composite, or really more technically a compound tense made up of two words working together to make a verb. When that happens, oftentimes they'll just leave out the word esse and you just get the participle only. So you have to watch out for that when you're translating Latin and it slips into indirect speech. You may just see a future active participle and you have to supply the word esse. You just have to imagine it or supply it for yourself. Let's move along to section 548 and let's talk about moods in indirect discourse. And here we're going to take a normal direct statement and then we're going to convert it into indirect speech. So number 1 and number 2 really contain the same message. It's just number 1 has the original message, and then number 2 has that message converted into indirect speech as someone relays it to someone else in a secondhand kind of way. And furthermore, we have a relative clause within the sentence. So let's take a look. Section 548, number 1 says, virum vidi qui erat fortis. So here's the original statement being spoken in the first person by the person who is originating or coming up with the thought or idea. Vidi is first person singular, perfect tense. So it says, I saw. Virum means man. That's accusative. And then we have qui erat fortis. That's a relative clause. Qui is a relative pronoun starting out the relative clause. It's singular and masculine because its antecedent virum is singular and masculine, but it's nominative because of the role it plays in the relative clause. Qui is the subject of the relative clause. We'll translate qui as who. Erat means he, she, or it was, and fortis means brave. That's a third declension adjective of 2 terminations. So the sentence says, I saw the man who was brave. So in number 2, we have someone else repeating that message in a secondhand kind of way. Perhaps someone didn't hear what the person said. So they say, what did he say? And then someone who did hear it turns to him and says, dicit se vidisse virum, qui esset fortis. Just like in the restaurant, when Sheila says that her soup is cold, Fred hears it, but you don't. So you turn to Fred and say, "What did she say?" And Fred says, "She says that her soup is cold." So number one would be the original message that Sheila is saying when she says that her soup is cold. But then number two would be like when Fred repeats it secondhand to you. So it starts with the verb decit. That's present tense. It means he, she, or it says. And then we have a subject accusative, say, and that's forming the subject of the indirect discourse. Widisse is a perfect tense infinitive, and then virum is accusative singular. That's the direct object of widisse. So the first part of this sentence says, he says that he saw a man, or the man, or it could also say, she says that she saw the man. In the translation, they're assuming that it's he. But these are not gendered verbs, so we don't know that it's he. It could very well be she. Decit and say are not gendered in any way. Say is the same reflexive pronoun, regardless of the speaker's gender or the person it's referring back to. You see lots of gendered verbs in Latin when they involve a participle, but this is not one of them. So decit say could mean he says that he, or it could say she says that she. Either way, it's present tense, and it launches us into indirect discourse. Remember that in indirect discourse, the infinitive verb is keyed to the tense of the main verb. The tense of the infinitive verb is relative to the tense of the main verb. So here the main verb is present tense, widisse is perfect tense. So the tense of the infinitive is before that of the main verb. So we need to translate widisse as being in the past. So we'll use the English word saw and say, he says that he saw, or she says that she saw, because widisse is in the past tense. Finally, we have the relative clause, qui esset fortis. Take a look down at the bottom of this page, and at the top of page 209, the next page, it says Rule 46. When direct discourse is made indirect, a principal declarative verb in the indicative becomes infinitive. Let's stop there. We're all familiar with that rule. We've been talking about it for ages. Nothing new there. But here's the important part. All subordinate verbs become or remain subjunctive. So here's the thing we need to think about as we go into the part of the sentence that says qui esset fortis. Here's the thing. In indirect discourse, all subordinate clauses will be with a subjunctive verb. And this is just a little rule for you to memorize. Subordinate clauses in indirect speech will have a subjunctive verb. Qui esset fortis is a subordinate clause. It's a relative clause, which is a subordinate clause. And so, just simply for grammatical reasons, it's going to have a subjunctive verb. So you may be asking, why is that a rule? Why is it that subordinate clauses in indirect speech have a subjunctive verb? I don't fully know. All I know is that it's a rule we need to be aware of. It could possibly have something to do with, sometimes in Latin, they'll say that things said on the authority of the person making the statement are in the indicative, things repeated from some other source, or things that are stated on someone else's authority may be subjunctive. So it could be something like that. I don't fully know. But, the subjunctive mood communicates uncertainty. And so when you're repeating something that someone else said, you're repeating something that someone else came up with. It's not thoughts or opinions that you yourself came up with. You're just repeating secondhand what someone else said or thought. So I'm speculating here, but it could be that this kind of structure is the Latin language's way of communicating that those thoughts and ideas are coming from someone else. and therefore are perhaps less real, less certain. I don't know. It's just something to think about. But regardless of that, the rule remains the same, that subordinate clauses in indirect speech will have a subjunctive verb. So here in section 548, we're looking at the conversion process of converting direct speech into indirect speech. The original statement is, number 1, I saw the man who was brave. And then for number 2, we're studying how that would be changed grammatically when it is expressed as indirect speech. As we turn the page to page 209, there are a few more things to talk about. First of all, at the very end of section 548, there's a note, imperative and most interrogative principal verbs become subjunctive. We just spoke about that a moment ago. Also, section 549, tenses. We've talked about that as well. And they mention the sequence of tenses when you're talking about the relationships between indicative and subjunctive verbs in indirect speech. We've talked about primary and secondary tenses. Primary tenses are anything present and future, while secondary tenses are past tenses. So we call that being in primary sequence or secondary sequence. In this book, they use the words principal and historic to refer to those tenses. So principal tenses are primary tenses. Historic tenses are secondary tenses. But there's a little bit of wiggle room. Sometimes you can use the present tense as a secondary tense if you're using it to talk about past events. We call that the historical present. So if you're using the present tense as a historical present, you're using it as a secondary tense, and so you can have subjunctive verbs in secondary sequence, even though they're coming after a main verb in the present tense. Also, when you're working with subjunctive verbs that need to follow the sequence of tenses, you have to look at whether the verb is communicating completed action or ongoing action. That's another little thing you have to look at. Another complicating factor is the fact that the perfect tense can be viewed as expressing past events, or the focus can be on the present effects of past events, and therefore the perfect tense can act in a primary kind of way. Also, when you are in indirect discourse, when you're trying to figure out what kind of tense you're working with, you have to look at the combination of participles and infinitives, if it's a compound tense. For example, laudaturum esse is a future active participle plus esse, talking about future activity. So you have to figure out the tense based on that, and then render your subordinate clauses from there. So there are a few moving parts here. And frankly, sometimes it's not always even clear what the Roman author even has in mind. For example, I've read sections of Tacitus where the entire thing is in indirect speech because it's supposed to be something that someone else said. And the indirect speech can just go on and on and on for a really long paragraph, and pretty soon you just lose track of who's saying what, and it can get kind of complicated. We learn these rules as best we can, but these are just textbook rules that we follow to try to help ourselves make sense of what we see out in the wild. That is when we read actual texts. And if you really want to get advanced at all this really advanced Latin grammar, I would recommend going beyond just what this lecture series has to offer. I feel like I've given you a good introduction to all this, but definitely if you really want to be a true Latinist and really understand all this stuff, you're going to have to go beyond what I can teach you. You're going to have to get out textbooks and do additional independent study. A really good textbook is Moreland and Fleischer. It's a big blue book. The title of it is Latin and Intensive Course. And we call it Moreland and Fleischer because those are the authors, Floyd Moreland and Rita Fleischer. Of course, there's also Allen and Greenough, but that one can be pretty encyclopedic. That's pretty heavy reading there, so that one's good for reference. But my point here is, don't be afraid to pick up a Latin textbook on your own. At this point, you've had enough Latin training now where you can start to go out on your own and start to find information on your own. There's an unbelievable amount of information on the internet, lots of great websites, great textbooks. One really good thing you can do is have 2 or 3 different textbooks on hand and then do studies of just one particular subject. For example, you could say, well, today I'm going to study tenses in indirect speech, and I'm going to study how the tense in indirect speech relates back to the main verb. And, maybe spend a week just exploring that one thing, isolating that one topic. And then the next week you could say, well, now I'm going to look at indirect questions and just study that one thing, focus on that one thing for a while. So there's a time to look at things in a broad way, and then there are times to focus in on one particular thing. So one day you could say, well, for this week, I'm going to look at websites, discussion groups, textbooks that all talk about subordinate clauses in indirect speech. I'm going to really try to understand that one particular thing. My personal belief is that the only person really who can teach you is you. When it comes to education, we all have to participate in our own education. We have to get to the point where we can explain something to ourselves before we can explain it to someone else. So as you get more advanced in Latin, try to see yourself moving from merely a student who is absorbing knowledge to someone who is out there taking more of an independent role, finding information for yourself, figuring it out for yourself. And as you transition into that kind of role, you're going to really find that you start to advance more as you go into more complicated grammatical issues. Let's move on now to section 550. And here, the authors of the book want to talk about pronouns. And the thing they want us to see, it's really not too difficult. What they want us to see is that if you repeat something secondhand that someone else said, you have to change the pronouns into the third person. For example, when Sheila says, "My soup is cold," and then Fred repeats that to you, it's no longer "my soup is cold." Now he's telling you what Sheila said, so she says that her soup is cold. So the word my is first person, but her, as a possessive, is third person. So you have to convert it from first person pronouns, first person possessives, first person verbs. You have to convert all that into the third person. So that's all they're telling us here in section 540. And we've seen that a lot in our readings of Caesar's Gallic Wars. For example, here on line 2, they say, ego and nos become se, meus and noster become suus. We've seen a million times where it says, Caesar says that he, blah, blah, blah. And the subject is always se. Caesar dicit se, blah, blah, blah. Caesar says that he is doing this or that. So if Caesar is going to Rome, the original thought or the original statement might be Caesar himself saying, I am going to Rome. But if you repeat it secondhand to someone else, you have to say, Caesar says that he is going to Rome. So instead of I am going to Rome, now it's he is going to Rome. So you're converting it from first person to third person. That's really all they're saying here in section 550. We have a couple of examples here. And again, we're going to do that thing where we take the original statement that was originally said, the original message, and then we're going to convert it into indirect speech as someone repeats it secondhand. And so we'll do that for each of these. In number 1, ego meum fratrem videbo. Ego means I. Videbo is first person singular. I will see. Meum fratrem, my brother. So I will see my brother. Simply from that sentence alone, we do not know whether the speaker is male or female. If we're only looking at that first sentence, we don't know. But there is a clue in the second sentence that does tell us the gender of the speaker. Let's take a look. It says, dicit se. Dicit is present tense, so that could mean he says or she says. And then se is a reflexive pronoun. It's not gendered. It could be the same for a man or a woman. So looking only at dicit and se, it could be saying he says that he, or she says that she. It really could be either of those. So se is the subject accusative. Again, the authors of the book want to point out that we've converted this first person statement, I will see my brother. Now we're repeating it secondhand, so it turns into a third person kind of statement. He says that he, she says that she. So we've gone from first person to third person. Now we need an infinitive to be the verb of the indirect statement. And so what do we have? Visurum esse. And so our verb here is a combination of a future active participle, visurum, that means about to see, and esse. So together they form a future active infinitive, to be about to see. And here's when we find out that the speaker of the original statement is in fact male, because visurum is masculine accusative singular. It's accusative because it needs to agree with the accusative se. It's singular because it's just one person who did the original statement, just one person spoke it. But it's masculine because of the um ending. If it were a woman, it would be visuram. But it's visurum, so it's masculine. And then suum fratrem. Suum is masculine because it needs to agree with fratrem, not because it agrees with the subject of the sentence. It's not linked to the subject. It's linked to the noun it modifies. In English, we link those kinds of adjectives to the speaker. If it's a woman talking, we'll say her brother. If it's a man talking, we'll say his brother, because it's linked to the speaker. In Latin, it's not the case. Suum here means his or her, but it's linked to fratrem. So the gender of suum is not connected to the gender of the speaker. So suum fratrem is the direct object of visurum esse. So that sentence says, he says that he will see his brother. But by merely changing one letter, if we change the second to last letter in visurum and make it visuram, now it reads, she says that she will see her brother. Because in indirect speech, oftentimes you have a participle working along with esse to make the infinitive verb that you need. And so participles are gendered, and they have to agree with the natural gender of the speaker. So with visurum, it's a male speaker. He says that he, blah, blah, blah. If it were visuram, it would be a female speaker. She says that she, blah, blah, blah. I think you get the idea. Let's move on to number 2. And here they're going to show us, again, converting the original statement from some other person into third person. In this case, it's a second person statement. Tu lacus videbis. You will see the lakes. Videbis is future tense, second person singular. Tu is a pronoun. Doesn't need to be there. It's just here emphasizing or strengthening the idea of you, second person singular. And lacus is a fourth declension noun in the accusative plural. lacus, with that long U there, that's fourth declension. So you will see the lakes. Now let's look at it in indirect speech. But this one has a little bit of a twist to it because it's not someone else repeating secondhand what someone else said, but it's the same person who said the first sentence. Whoever spoke that sentence is now the speaker of the second sentence too. So the speaker is repeating what he said. He's repeating his own statement. For example, if you're at the restaurant with Sheila and Fred, and you say, "What did Sheila say?" And then Sheila leans forward and says, "I said my soup is cold." If that happens, then she's repeating her own statement. So it's still indirect speech in a sense, because she's repeating what she said and framing it in a different way with, "I said that my soup is cold." But that's kind of what's happening here. The same person who spoke the original message is the same person who's repeating it to someone else. So it's kind of an interesting twist here. So Dixie is perfect tense. It says, "I said." And then illum is a form of ille, the demonstrative. It could be a demonstrative pronoun, a demonstrative adjective. Here it's a demonstrative pronoun. It's not paired up with anything. It's not modifying a noun. Here it's just a pronoun, and it's in the accusative because it's the subject accusative of an indirect statement. So literally, I said that in the sense of that guy. So when you read the word illum, you need to think of that in the sense of that person, that guy, that man. It's referring to a person, in other words. The verb is visurum esse. That's a future infinitive comprised of a future active participle plus esse. So the main verb takes us into the past, dixi, but then the infinitive verb takes us into the future from that past time of the main verb. And when you see that, they often use the word would to render that. We could say, "I said that guy will see the lakes." That would work. I said that guy will see the lakes. That's perfectly fine. Generally, they tend to translate it as would, especially in this book. So the translation here is, "I said that he would see the lakes." So judging from these two sentences here in number 2, we don't know the gender of the speaker, the person saying these sentences. Whoever it is, it's the same person saying both. Tu lacus videbis, that could be spoken by a man or a woman. Dixi illum lacus visurum esse, that could be spoken by a man or a woman. We don't know the gender of the speaker, but we do know the gender of the person that's supposed to be seeing the lakes at some point. That person is male because illum is masculine. If it were a woman, if someone were talking to a woman and saying, "Excuse me, ma'am, but you're going to see the lakes," in that case, it would be dixi illum. And then also, you'd get visurum esse. So if someone says, "Excuse me, ma'am, you're going to see the lakes," and then they repeat themselves, it would be dixi illum lacus visurum esse. I said that she will see the lakes, or I said that she would see the lakes. I'm taking a long time to pick through these examples, but I'm doing that on purpose because oftentimes in Latin, the people who are doing the things in the sentence are not clearly spelled out. Sometimes in Latin, you have a speaker mentioned or some person mentioned, and then for the next paragraph, all you get is just ungendered verbs and different nouns and adjectives that aren't connected to the speaker. And it's possible that there just won't be many clues about who is being referred to. So you really have to pay close attention to noun endings, genders, the gendered endings of participles, the endings of demonstratives, case and gender. sometimes there will be a demonstrative that has the same ending for masculine and feminine, so it's not clear who it's referring to. In fact, I recently took a placement test. It's a long story, but I was taking a Latin skill level test, and the entire reading was just like that. The entire reading was the kind of reading where the subject was mentioned and then hardly even referenced at all. And so there were all these demonstratives and verbs that were switching back and forth between two parties, and it was not easy to figure out who each thing was talking about. So if you really want to get a correct idea of what a Latin text is saying, you really have to be detail-oriented and read the fine print, so to speak. You have to look at all the tiny details that communicate meaning. You know, Roman authors could load down their writing with all kinds of clear, repetitive nouns and pronouns that really spell everything out. They could do that, but they don't. Sometimes it's just understood, and you just have to keep track on your own of what's happening. So as you advance in your Latin skills, take care to read Latin in a very detail-oriented way so you can squeeze all the meaning out of it that is intended, and so that you can keep up with the action and understand the subtleties of what the language is communicating to you. Let's go on to section 551 and look at vocabulary. We only have 2 new words for this lesson. One is colo colere, colui cultum. That's a verb of the 3rd conjugation. And we'll see it in this text in an agricultural context. And in fact, this is where we get our English word agriculture. The word agriculture is made up of the word ager, which means field or land, and then this word colo. As you can see, the 4th principal part is cultum. So ager plus cultum, put it all together, agriculture. Moving on, we have a deponent verb, polikeor, polikeri, policitus sum, which means to promise. And that's it for vocabulary, just 2 new words. So let's go on to section 552. That's our exercises for this lesson. Go ahead and turn off the recording and do all the exercises. And when you're finished, turn the recording back on, and we'll go over them together. Okay, hopefully by now you've completed your homework. Let's go over the exercises together, starting with number 1. Number 1 says, Nobis est in animo, iter per provinciam facere. Propterea quod, aliud iter non habemus. We start out with a dative of possession. Nobis is dative plural for nos, the pronoun that means we. So nobis est says it is to us, in the sense of we have it. In animo means in mind. And so the idea here is that we have it in mind, in the sense of we intend. And so if we say we intend, the next natural thing is an infinitive. And so we have facere, which means to do or to make. And that's part of the idiom iter facere, which means to make a journey, make a march, do a journey, do a march, something like that. We can translate it simply as to march. Per provinciam says through the province. So the first part of the sentence says, we intend to make a march, or simply to march through the province. Propterea means on account of, and then quod means something like that, or the fact that. Put it together, and propterea quod says, on account of the fact that, or because of the fact that. Non habemus says we do not have. Aliud iter says another route. Aliud is neuter because iter is neuter. So number 1 says, we intend to march through the province on account of the fact that we do not have another route. Number 2, dixerunt sibi esse in animo, iter per provinciam facere, propterea quod, aliud iter non haberent. Here we have the same thing that's being said in exercise 1, but here it's being reported by someone else, and so therefore is converted into indirect discourse. So we start out with dixerunt. That's a perfect tense form of the verb dico, which means to say. So dixerunt says, they said. Exercise 1 was spoken by someone speaking in the first person. In the first person, plural, it is to us in the sense of we intend. And then habemus is we have. Now all that gets converted into the third person within the indirect speech. So dixerunt says they said, and then sibi is a dative reflexive pronoun referring back to the they, that is the party that is saying the statement. Our infinitive verb here is esse, which is present tense, so we need to put that in the same tense or time frame as the main verb. The main verb, dixerunt, is perfect tense. That's in the past, so we'll translate esse in the past too. So we'll translate esse as was. So far what we have is, they said that it was to them. And then again, in animo means in mind. So they said that it was to them in mind, in the sense of they said that they had it in mind, in the sense of they intended. So we have two idiomatic expressions here. One is the dative of possession, and the other is having something in mind as a way to say that you intend something. So all that adds up to they said that they intended. And then facere iter per provinciam, to make a march through the province, or just simply to march through the province. The causal clause that we saw in number 1, propterea quod, aliud iter non habemus, that's considered to be a subordinate clause, and so here that's going to get rendered with a subjunctive verb. So notice that haberent is subjunctive. That's an imperfect subjunctive. So this last part says, on account of the fact that they did not have another route. So number 2 altogether says, they said that they intended to march through the province on account of the fact that they did not have another route. Number 3 is next. Ita nos de populo Romano meriti sumus, ut nostri agri vastari non debeant. This is taken from the part where the Haidui complain to Julius Caesar about the injustices that they are suffering. And so the subject is nos, which means we. It's spoken in the first person plural, that is. And meriti sumus is a form of the verb merior, which means to deserve. So meriti sumus says we deserved de populo Romano, from the Roman people. And ita means thus. So it says something like, thus we deserved from the Roman people. You may notice that footnote number 1 says present perfect. That's referring to the fact that in the subordinate clause, we have a subjunctive verb that's in primary sequence. And so meriti sumus, being perfect tense, you might expect it to be treated as though it's in secondary sequence, but debeant is primary sequence. And so the authors of the book are reminding us here that the perfect tense can be primary sequence if the focus is on the present. Sometimes the present tense can focus more on a past activity. Sometimes it can focus more on the lasting effects of a past activity. If I say, I painted the fence, that sounds like it's focused more on the past. But if I say, I have painted the fence, that makes it sound more like something that pertains to the present. I have painted the fence. It's got a feeling of pertaining to right now. I have it. So the perfect tense has some wiggle room. It can sort of go both ways. And so in Latin, it can be primary or secondary sequence. And so that's what we have here is the perfect tense functioning as primary sequence. And then we have another primary sequence verb, debeant. And so this whole thing is in primary sequence. Quick reminder, the sequence of tenses says that if the main clause is in one sequence, then a subordinate clause has to be in the same sequence. That's what we're talking about here. So our subordinate clause here, ut nostri agri vastari non debeant. So nostri agri says our fields. Debeant is the verb debeo, which means to owe or to be obligated. We can translate it with the English verb ought, as in I ought to exercise or I ought to go shopping. In English, when we say I ought to exercise, what you're really saying is that I owe it to exercise. I owe that in the sense of I'm obligated to do that. That's really what's being said. And so it's perfectly natural that in Latin we would use debeo to express that. So nostri agri debeant says our fields owe, or better yet, our fields ought. And then vastari, that's the verb vasto, which means to destroy, devastate. In fact, that's part of our English word devastate. So this subordinate clause says that our fields ought not to be destroyed. Vastari is a passive infinitive. So you could look at this entire subordinate clause as a noun clause that is the direct object of the verb meriti sumus. So number 3 says, thus we deserved from the Roman people that our fields ought not to be destroyed. Now in number 4, we're going to have that same thing, but being repeated secondhand and therefore converted into indirect speech. So it starts with dicunt, that's third person plural, present tense, and it means they say or they are saying. And then say is a reflexive pronoun referring back to the people doing the talking. So dicunt, ita, and say will say this. They say that thus did they, something like that. And meritos esse is the infinitive verb. That's esse plus a perfect passive participle. Together they make a perfect tense infinitive. Here the verb is deponent, so it's really an active perfect tense infinitive. So they say that they thus deserved. The main verb is present tense. Meritos esse is perfect, so we'll translate it in the past. De popolo Romano means the same thing as before, from the Roman people. And now our subordinate clause, this ut clause, has been converted into having a subjunctive verb. Deberent is imperfect subjunctive. So sui agri means their fields. Vastari, that's a passive infinitive. Non deberent, saying that they ought not to be. Again, you can view the ut clause here as a noun clause that is the direct object of meritos esse. So number 4 says, they say that thus they deserved from the Roman people that their fields ought not to have been destroyed. Number 5 is next. Si pacem populus Romanus cum Helvetiis faciet in aliam partem Galliae ebunt. Here we have a future more vivid condition with future tense in both protasis and apodosis. In the protasis, the subject is the Roman people. Faciet is future tense. He, she, or it will make. And pacem means peace. cum Helvetiis says with the Helvetii. So the protasis says if the Roman people will make peace with the Helvetii. Now we have the apodosis. The verb is ebunt. That's the verb eo, which means to go, but it's in the future tense. So ebunt says they will go. We don't have an explicitly stated subject. It seems to be referring to the Helvetii. In aliam partem says into another part, and then Gallii says of Gaul. So it seems to say if the Roman people will make peace with the Helvetii, they, referring to the Helvetii, will go into another part of Gaul. Number 6 is next. And in number 6, we're going to have the same thing that was said in exercise 5, but here being repeated secondhand and therefore converted into indirect speech. Putavit si pacem populus Romanus cum Helvetiis faceret, eos in aliam partem Gallii ituros. We start off with putavit. That's the verb puto, which means to think in the sense of suppose something. So putavit says he, she, or it thought, and then that can start off indirect speech. So he, she, or it thought that si pacem populus Romanus, it's all the same stuff from number 5. So he or she thought that if the Roman people should make peace with the Helvetii, and notice how really the only part of the sentence that's really converted into indirect speech is the apodosis. The protasis is really just treated as a subordinate clause within indirect speech. So from a structural standpoint, only the apodosis has the accusative plus infinitive kind of construction. And so the subject accusative there in the apodosis is eos, and then the verb is ituros. That's a future active participle of the verb eo, which means to go. So ituros means about to go. It's accusative plural masculine to match eos. Here we have a suppressed esse. Technically for it to be an infinitive, it needs to have esse, but oftentimes Roman authors just leave off the esse part and you just get the participle. So think of this as saying eos plus ituros esse. So with putavit and then eos and then ituros esse, you would have this. He or she thought that they in the future would go. Ituros esse would be a future active infinitive. That they would go in aliam partem Gallii, into another part of Gaul. So number 6 altogether says, he or she thought that if the Roman people should make peace with the Helvetii, that they would go into another part of Gaul. Again, it's structured in such a way that only the apodosis has the accusative plus infinitive construction, and the protasis is presented as a subordinate clause. So you could almost put the apodosis first and say, he or she thought that they would go into another part of Gaul if the Roman people would make peace with the Helvetii. Notice also that in the original version, number 5, this was a future more vivid conditional, with the protasis having a future tense verb. And so that's been converted into the subordinate clause here with an imperfect subjunctive, faceret. So in the original version, that was not subjunctive. It's subjunctive here in number 6 because it's a subordinate clause within indirect speech, not because it's reflecting the kind of conditional that it was in the original. Number 7 is next. Si obsides a vobis mihi dabuntur, uti ea quae polekemini vos facturos intelligam, vobiscum pacem faciam. Here we have yet another future more vivid conditional. The protasis has dabuntur. That's the verb do, which means give. It's future, third person plural, passive. So they will be given is what dabuntur says. And obsides is the subject. That's hostages. So if hostages will be given, and then we have an ablative of agent, a wobis, means by y'all. And then mihi means to me. That's the recipient of the hostages. So if hostages will be given by y'all to me, and then the apodosis is wobiscum pacem faciam. But before that, we have a purpose clause that is working from the protasis. So uti is just another spelling for ut, and it's introducing a purpose clause. It's the purpose of the giving of the hostages. So uti plus intelligam will say, so that I might know. Intelligam is present subjunctive, first person singular. And of course, knowing something, that's a verb of the head or heart, and it can initiate indirect speech. So after intelligam, within this purpose clause, we have some indirect speech. The structure is, so that I might know that blah, blah, blah will happen. We need an accusative to be the subject, that's vos, and we need an infinitive to be the verb, that's facturos, and you need to supply esse along with it. So it's facturos esse. So the idea is, so that I might know that y'all, that's vos, facturos esse, will do. And then ea is the direct object of facturos esse. It's neuter plural, and so it means something like these things or those things or the things. When you have a neuter demonstrative like that, it often refers to unspecified, inanimate objects or concepts. In English, it would sound good to say the things, because we have a relative clause starting with quae. So we'll translate quae as which, and polykemeni is one of our new words for this lesson. That's polykeior, which means promise. And here it's second person plural, so it means y'all promise. So the entire exercise is a conditional. Within the conditional, we have a purpose clause. Within the purpose clause, we have some indirect speech. Within the indirect speech, we have a relative clause. So lots of layers here. So by the time we get to quae polykemeni, we're about 4 layers deep inside of this exercise. So what we have so far would say this: if hostages will be given by y'all to me, so that I might know that y'all will do the things which y'all are promising. That's what we have so far. And then for our apodosis, we have faciam, which means I will make. That's actually future, not like intelligam, which is present subjunctive, but faciam is actually future. So it says I will make, and then pacem is peace, and wobiscum means with y'all. So if hostages will be given by y'all to me, so that I might know that y'all will do the things which y'all are promising, I will make peace with y'all. A lot of moving parts there, and it's about to get more challenging because we're going to convert the whole thing into indirect speech. So number 8 starts with dicit. Dicit means he or she or it says, and now the whole thing gets converted into indirect speech. Si obsides ab eis sibi dentur, uti ea quae polykeiantur facturos intelligat, se cum eis pacem facturum. So not only does the speaker of that original sentence, not only does the person speaking get put into the third person, but the party that the speaker was saying all that to, the recipient of that message, is also converted here into third person. So ab eis, that's a third person thing. Instead of intelligam, we have intelligat, that's third person. Cum eis, again, that's all third person. So the speaker and the recipient all now are being rendered in the third person. So dicit starts us out. It says, he or she says. Then we'll throw in the word that. And again, the protasis has been rendered here as a subordinate clause in indirect speech. Only the apodosis has the accusative plus infinitive construction. That's a se, and then facturum. So the protasis says, he or she says that if hostages should be given, that's dentur, present tense passive, ab eis means by them, and then sibi is reflexive, referring back to the person saying the si obsides stuff. The protasis, if we assume it's a man talking, then it would say this. He says that if hostages should be given by them to him, in the sense of to the guy doing the talking. So sibi is reflexive, referring back to the originator of the message, the person who said the original message. And then eis is referring to the vobis from the original message. So all these first and second person pronouns and verbs have been converted to third person. Continuing on, uti and intelligat, so that he might know. Intelligat is just a present tense subjunctive. So that he might know. And then again, within this purpose clause, we have some indirect speech. Facturos is a future active participle. We need to supply esse. I would really prefer to have some kind of subject accusative here as the subject, instead of just merely having facturos esse. I guess you don't really need it, but it might be a little bit more clear. You know, we could have perhaps eos, an accusative plural form of isea id. We could perhaps have illos, an accusative plural form of ille, something to be the subject accusative of facturos esse. But I guess we don't really need it. You can think of facturos esse as containing a pronoun, I suppose. So uti plus intelligat plus facturos esse would say, so that he might know that they will do. See, back in number 7, we had vos as the subject accusative of facturos esse. Here in number 8, they haven't converted vos into anything. So it doesn't really map onto any particular word here. And then ea, that means the things. That's the direct object of facturos esse. And then quae polikeantur, which they are promising. Polikeantur is subjunctive because this relative clause here now is a subordinate clause within indirect speech. In the original version, number 7, polykemeni was not subjunctive. If it were subjunctive, it would be polykeameni. But as it stands now, polykemeni is just merely present tense indicative. For some reason, they've put polikeantur here in number 8 because it's a subordinate clause in indirect speech, but for some reason they didn't do that in number 7. I don't know why they did that. So the purpose clause says, so that he might know that they will do, facturos esse, the things which they are promising. And finally, the apodosis coming off of dicit. Dicit is he or she says. He says that se, that he, and then facturum esse, we need to supply the word esse along with facturum. Facturum is a future active participle. It's accusative singular to match se. He says that he will make facturum esse peace with them. So the whole thing, assuming that it's a man speaking this sentence, would say, he says that if hostages should be given by them to him so that he might know that they will do the things which they are promising, he will make peace with them. Number 9 is next. Postquam Germani agros Gallicos viderunt, colere eos voluerunt. Postquam means after. The subject is Germani, that means Germans. Viderunt is perfect tense, it means they saw. And the direct object is the agros Gallicos, the Gallic fields. So after the Germans saw the Gallic fields, then we have voluerunt, which again is perfect tense. It means they wanted, they is the Germans, they wanted colere, to cultivate, eos, which means them. Eos is referring back to the fields. Eos is a form of id, accusative plural, to match agros. So after the Germans saw the Gallic fields, they wanted to cultivate them. Number 10 is next. Dicebat postquam Germani agros Gallicos vidissent, se colere eos voluisse. Here we have number 9 converted into indirect speech. It's being presented as though it's being restated by someone. So someone is saying, dicebat, he or she was saying. The part about after the Germans saw the fields, that part is being presented here as a subordinate clause within indirect speech. So it's just being treated as a temporal clause, which is a subordinate clause. So vidissent is subjunctive, and then starting from se colere, that's where you get the accusative plus infinitive construction. So vidissent is pluperfect. So it might say this. He was saying that after the Germans had seen the Gallic fields, that, and then going on to se colere eos voluisse, se is the subject accusative, voluisse is a perfect tense infinitive, that's volo, which means want, and then colere eos, to cultivate them. So the main verb here, dicebat, is imperfect tense, that's in the past, and so vidissent is pluperfect, so we need to translate vidissent as had. He was saying that after the Germans had seen the Gallic fields, se colere eos voluisse. So voluisse is perfect tense, and so really we ought to put voluisse as being before the time of the dicebat verb, because that's how you're supposed to do it. If voluisse were instead a present tense infinitive, we could say he was saying that they wanted to cultivate them, but voluisse is before that. But the only way to make voluisse before dicebat is to put it in the pluperfect. So that might sound weird if we say he was saying that they had wanted to cultivate them. And also it might make it sound like them wanting to cultivate the fields is happening at the same time as when they saw the fields. So maybe it's best just to say wanted. So we're trying to translate the Latin accurately, but also make it sound like it means something in English, something that is understandable. So let's say wanted. Let's say he was saying that after the Germans had seen the Gallic fields, that they wanted to cultivate them. We'll translate voluisse simply as wanted. Number 11 is next. Ubi est legatus primae legionis. This is just a simple interrogative question. Ubi means where, est means is, legatus means the general here in this context. Of course, legatus can also mean ambassador. Here, it's primae legionis, of the first legion. So the context obviously is referring to the general of a legion. So we could translate legatus as general or perhaps lieutenant general. So number 11, where is the lieutenant general of the First Legion? Number 12 is next. Rogat ubi sit legatus primae legionis. Here we have the same thing as in number 11. It's that same sentiment or that same question, but it's being repeated secondhand by someone else. Somebody else is saying, Rogat, he or she is asking. And so that interrogative question there now gets converted into an indirect question. Why is it an indirect question? Because it's being repeated by somebody else. So in the original question, it's ubi est legatus. Here, as an indirect question, it's ubi sit legatus with a subjunctive verb. So assuming it's a man doing the talking, it would say, he is asking, where is the general of the First Legion? Again, that's an indirect question with a subjunctive verb. For a smoother word order in English, we might say this. He is asking where the Lieutenant General of the First Legion is. We might put the word is at the end like that for a little bit better sound in English, but it's exactly the same as if we had put the word is earlier and said, he is asking where is the Lieutenant General of the First Legion. Let's move on to section 554. That's our reading for this lesson from Caesar's Gallic Wars. Quick review. The Helvetii are heading west across what today would be France. They had promised that as they cross through the territory of the Sequani and the Haidui, that they would not cause any problems. But now, according to the text, they are destroying the territory that they're crossing through. They're apparently taking all the food. And so now the Haidui, that's a tribe that is allied with Rome. We learned a few lessons back that one of their kings had been given a diplomatic title or some kind of title of friend of the Roman people. Ironically, it was a Haiduan, Duikiakis, who worked out this deal in the first place, trying to get permission for the Helvetii to cross over the territory of the Sequani. We don't know if he also obtained permission from the government of the Helvetii. Again, this historical text is really all we have about this material. There's nothing really to compare it with. We're just taking Julius Caesar's word for it. So anyway, the Haidui are heading west. They're going through the territory of the Haidui, and they're causing lots of problems. So now the Haidui come to Caesar and ask for help. So that's where we are plot-wise. Let's read our Latin text here. Helvetii iam per angustias et fines sequanorum suas copias traduxerant. The subject here is Haidui. The verb is traduxerant. That's the verb that is trans plus duco, literally to lead across. The N and the S in trans go away, and you just get traduco. And this is pluperfect. So it says the Helvetii had led across, and the direct object is kopios, which can mean troops, forces, soldiers. Let's translate it as forces. So what that gives us so far is the Helvetii had led across the forces. We have suas here, so it's their forces. Iam means already. Then we have per angustias. Angustias is plural. It's very similar to our English expression, going through the narrows. You know, if you're a sailor and you're sailing through the narrows, it means you're going through some kind of narrow passage. So in the plural here, angustia means a narrow passage. It's kind of a collective kind of noun, plural, but meaning a narrow passage. So let's translate per angustias as through the narrow passageway or through the narrow pass, something like that. So the Helvetii had already led across their forces through the narrow pass. And then we have et fines Sequanorum, and the territory of the Sequani. So the Helvetii had already led across their forces through the narrow pass and the territory of the Sequani. I think the narrow pass being referred to is, if you refer back to the Lenny's Latin class website, on the study helps page, if you go down to the third map, the one that's mostly pink, and click on that and zoom in a bit, the narrow pass is the dotted blue line that is between the Rhone River and the bottom of the Jura mountain range. And then you can see as you go west from there, the next thing is the Sequani. So that pink map there, the third one, that outlines this pretty well. So when it says the Helvetii had already gone through the narrow passageway and the territory of the Sequani, that's what's happening here, is they've already passed through the dotted blue line area, that difficult, narrow place, and they've already gone through the territory of the Sequani, and now they've gone into the territory of the Haidui. So if you look at the first map on that page, you can see that starting from the territory of the Helvetii, if you go west, you hit the Jura Mountains, then you hit the Sequani, and then you hit the Haidui after that, as you head from east to west. On this map, it's not spelled Haidui, it's just spelled Idui. There's no H. But anyway, looking at the map, you can trace their progress as they go from east to west, and so it helps the text to make sense if you can actually see on a map the places being referred to. So that's why I have these maps here, is to help you track the progress of the various events. Moving along, et in haiduorum fines pervenerant. Okay, the verb here is pervenerant. That is the verb per plus venio, which literally means to come through. Often we translate it as arrive. And then in haiduorum fines, that's a prepositional phrase, in plus fines, and it's sandwiching a genitive. So it says into the territory of the Haidui. Okay, so taking it from the top, the Helvetii had already led across their forces through the narrow pass and the territory of the Sequani, and had arrived into the territory of the Haidui. Here we have in taking the accusative, so it's got the idea of into. We could even say, and had come through into the territory of the Haidui. Pervenerant is also pluperfect, just as traduxerant is pluperfect. So we can say that they had arrived into the territory of the Haidui, or perhaps they had come through into the territory of the Haidui. Next we have eorumque agros populabantur. Our verb here is populor, which means to destroy, to devastate, to lay waste. It's a deponent verb, and so this particular form, being imperfect, and it looks like it's third-person plural passive, but it's really active because it's a deponent verb. So populabantur says they were devastating, they were laying waste, they were destroying. We could even say ravaging. The direct object is agros, which means field, and eorum means of them. That's a genitive plural form of is-id, and it's referring to the Haidui. It's the fields of the Haidui that they were ravaging. In fact, this is a good chance to see the difference between suus sua suum and eis or eorum. So I've told you many times that suus sua suum means his, her, its, or their, referring back to the subject of the sentence. But eis or eorum means his, her, its, or their, referring to someone other than the subject of the sentence. And we see that here on line 1, we've got suas. On line 3, we've got eorum. So the subject of all these clauses here on the first 3 lines, the subject is the helvetii. So when something is theirs, it's referred to as suus sua suum. When something is referred to as belonging to someone else other than the helvetii, it's referred to using eius, or in this case, eorum. Okay, so on line 1, they lead across their own troops or forces, not someone else's, but their own forces. So we get suas kopias. Suus sua suum is used because the troops belong to the subject. That's the helvetii. But then on line 3, they're ravaging the fields of somebody else that's not the subject, someone other than the helvetii. So instead of saying suos agros populabantur, it's eorum. If it said on line 3, just hypothetically, if it said suos agros populabantur, that would mean that the helvetii were destroying their own fields. But when it's eorum, it means someone other than the subject. Who could it be? Well, the Haidui were mentioned a few words before on line 2, mentioning how they arrived in the territory of the Haidui. So the eorum is referring to the Haidui. Okay, so suus sua suum, that first and second declension adjective, and eius and eorum, those genitive forms of isea id, the thing they have in common is they can be translated into English in the same way. His, her, its, their, that kind of thing. So in English, his, her, its, their, it doesn't tell you if it's the subject's or someone else's. It's not clear. But in Latin, you can tell because of their choice of words, whether they pick suus sua suum or eius or eorum. You can tell if it's something belonging to the subject or something belonging to someone other than the subject. So here in these first 3 lines of the text, this is a great way to compare and learn about the use of suus sua suum versus eius and eorum. So plot-wise, the helvetii have gone into the territory of the Haidui, and now they are destroying the fields. So now the Haidui are going to go to Caesar and ask for help. Let's keep reading on line 3. It says, Haidui cum se suaque ab eis defendere non possent, legatos ad Caesarem mittunt, rogatum auxilium. The subject here is Haidui. The verb is mittunt, that means they send, and then legatos is the direct object, that's ambassadors. Okay, so the skeleton of the sentence is Haidui mittunt legatos. The Haidui send ambassadors. This is historical present, so we're using the present tense to talk about past events in a vivid kind of way. Notice that since we are in the historical present, it's being treated as secondary sequence. And so possent, in the cum clause there, possent is imperfect subjunctive. So we're in secondary sequence here as far as the sequence of tenses is concerned. Okay, so the cum clause here says, cum se suaque ab eis defendere non possent. So we have to figure out if this is cum circumstantial, cum causal, or cum concessive. It's not cum temporal because then we'd have an indicative verb. Okay, so non possent says they were not able. Defendere, to defend. And then se is the direct object of defendere. We'll translate se as themselves because it's reflexive. It's referring back to the plural group of people, the Haidui. And then we have suaque, that's the word sua with the que ending. Sua is accusative, neuter plural. There's no noun paired with it. It's just sua, and so it's a substantive adjective, meaning their stuff, their possessions, their property. Again, we see the neuter gender being used to talk about things and stuff. So se suaque, que provides the word and, right? So se suaque means themselves and their stuff, or themselves and their possessions. So sua is a substantive adjective, and we have to read into that the idea of possessions or property. Ab eis means from them. Again, we see se being used as a reflexive, but then isea id is being used to talk about someone other than the subject. So ab eis is referring back to the helvetii. This section of the sentence says the haidui were not able to defend themselves and their property and their possessions from them, meaning the helvetii. So does cum mean under the circumstances that? Does it mean since or because? Or does it mean although? So let's try it a couple of different ways. The haidui, although they were not able to defend themselves and their property from them, although all that happened, they send ambassadors to Caesar to ask for help. That doesn't really work because it makes it sound like them not being able to defend themselves is not working along with the idea of them asking for help. So that doesn't make any sense. What about under the circumstances that they were not able to defend themselves, they ask for help? Possibly, but the best one is because they were not able to defend themselves, they ask for help. That's the best translation here. And so this cum clause is a cum causal clause. And so we'll translate cum as since or because to communicate the idea that it's because of that reason. So taking it from haidui, it says, the haidui, since they were not able to defend themselves and their property from them, they send ambassadors to Caesar. Then we have our old friend, the supine. Rogatum is an accusative supine expressing purpose. Rogatum is the verb rogo, which means ask, and here it's an accusative supine. Remember that an accusative supine can express purpose when it's deployed along with a verb of motion. And what do we have right before rogatum? We have mittunt. That's a verb of motion. They're sending someone, in this case, ambassadors. So legatos ad Caesarem mittunt rogatum. Those words right there will say they send ambassadors to Caesar for the purpose of asking, or in order to ask, or more simply, to ask. But the idea here with rogatum is that it's expressing purpose. Again, it's an accusative supine working along with a verb of motion to express purpose. And then auxilium means help, and that's the direct object of the idea of asking. The verb of asking here, rogatum, the thing being asked for, is help. And so auxilium is accusative singular. So this whole section here, the haidui, since they were not able to defend themselves and their possessions from them, meaning the helvetii, they send ambassadors to Caesar to ask for help. Moving along, you can see here that there's a quotation mark in the book after the word auxilium. We have a colon and then a quotation mark and then a closing quotation mark at the end after debuerent. And so what's going on here? Well, he's telling us the kind of thing that they said, the ambassadors that the haidui sent, that is. So before the word ita, between auxilium and ita, we need to think of the idea of, and here's what they said. Or perhaps they say that this is all being treated as present tense. So we can say perhaps the word dicunt is understood here. And then we go into indirect speech. Once we get to the word ita, we are in repeated speech. It's Caesar repeating to us secondhand what was said by the Haiduan ambassadors. So naturally, in Latin, when you do that, you use indirect speech. And so in order to do that, we need a subject in the accusative and a verb in the infinitive. The subject accusative is se, referring back to the Haidui, or perhaps the Haiduan ambassadors representing the Haidui, saying that on behalf of the Haidui. And then meritos esse is the infinitive verb. So in our English translation, we'll throw in they say, as if the word dikunt is understood, and we'll throw in the word that because we're going into indirect speech. So the Haidui send ambassadors to Caesar to ask for help. End of sentence. They say that ita se omni tempore. And this shouldn't be too difficult because we've studied several exercises with this kind of construction in it. They've given us lots of stuff like this for practice. So se is the subject accusative. We'll translate it as they, referring to the Haidui. And then meritos esse is the verb merior, which means to deserve. It's a deponent verb. And so meritos esse ends up as a perfect tense active infinitive. Meritos is accusative plural masculine to match se. So the idea here is they say that they deserved. De populo Romano says from the Roman people. Omni tempore is an ablative of time when. It means something like at all times or all the time. It's not plural. It's not omnibus temporibus. It's singular, omni tempore, but we can translate it probably as at all times to make it into smooth English. And then ita we can translate as thus. So the Haidui are having their fields destroyed by the Helvetii. And so they come to Caesar and they say this. They say, thus we deserved at all times from the Roman people. And what's happening here is they're pleading their case. They're trying to present their point of view in such a way where they are trying to get Caesar to help them. They're talking about what they deserve, possibly referencing the fact that they are allies of Rome, that they have perhaps supported Roman interests in the past. So they're saying basically that they deserve something, that they deserve to be treated in a certain way, that perhaps the Romans are somehow obligated to act in a certain way toward them. Again, this could be referencing some kind of diplomatic relationship between the Romans and the Haidui. So let's keep reading and we'll find out more about what is going on here. And next we have the word ut, and then we have a big ut clause here that explains all the things that they're saying that they deserve. Basically saying that they deserve that blah, blah, blah. So that's what ut is doing here. And this whole ut clause here is just one big noun clause that's functioning as the direct object of meritos esse. And the key to unlocking this part of the reading is the last word. That's debuerent. That's the verb debeo, which we've talked about. It means to owe something. And we can use it like in English when we say that something ought to happen or I ought to do something. Debuerent here is perfect tense subjunctive. It looks just the same as if it were future perfect, but it's not. It's subjunctive, perfect tense. And I think it's perfect tense because, well, first of all, we're in secondary sequence within the indirect speech. Meritos esse is perfect tense, which here seems to be talking about past events. Of course, when you convert things into indirect speech, you don't have as many choices for how you express things. When you are composing a verb to be the infinitive verb of indirect speech, you really only have three tenses to choose from. You can choose a present tense infinitive, a future infinitive, or a perfect tense infinitive. In Latin, there's no such thing as an imperfect tense infinitive or a pluperfect tense infinitive. So when we look at meritos esse, it's hard to know if the ambassadors were going to try to say that something was ongoing in past time or if it is completed. Because if they want to talk about something that's in the past, they only have really one choice for an infinitive. Your choices are limited, in other words. So whatever the original statement was, it has to be sort of collapsed down or simplified down in such a way where it gets rendered with just one of these three infinitive possibilities, present, perfect, or future. When you're in direct speech, just saying something in a normal way, you have access to the entire range of Latin verbs, subjunctives, indicatives, all the tenses, all the participles. But then when it gets converted into indirect speech, there's a simplification or a collapsing down that has to occur as the original verb gets converted into just one of three possible infinitive tenses. And again, those infinitive tenses are keyed or in relation to the tense of the main verb. It feels as though we're in secondary sequence because, as I mentioned on line 4, possent is imperfect subjunctive. So that seems to suggest that Caesar views this as secondary sequence, that the present tense verbs here are historical present, and so the perfect tense verb here that we see in debuerent, possibly that's been selected instead of the imperfect subjunctive. Perhaps that's been selected because it's supposed to show that the action is completed, that the fields have already been destroyed in the past, and that the action is done. But anyway, the ut clause here, starting on line 6, ut paene in conspectu, it's a subordinate clause in indirect speech, so it's going to have a subjunctive verb anyway. It appears here that the choice of the perfect tense subjunctive is showing that the action is complete. That's about the best I can do to explain this choice. So anyway, debuerent is being negated by non. So the idea here is that some plural things ought not to have happened. Again, debuerent is third person plural, perfect subjunctive. So it means something like they did not owe, they were not obligated, or they ought not, something like that. And why is it plural? Because nostri agri is plural on line 7. That's the subject of debuerent, and also liberi, and also opida. So we have 3 plural subjects all reusing the verb debuerent. And then each of those is working with an infinitive. So here's how it works. Nostri agri on line 7 says our fields. And then you put in non debuerent. Our fields did not owe it in the sense of they ought not. And then vastari is a passive infinitive that means to be destroyed. That's the verb vasto, related to our English word devastate. So nostri agri, then non debuerent, and then vastari. That's the English word order. Our fields did not owe it to be destroyed. The sense is our fields didn't deserve to be destroyed, or it shouldn't have happened that our fields were destroyed. That's the sense of it. To try to put that into English in such a way where it sounds like the past, we could say, our fields ought not to have been destroyed. Literally, it's our fields did not owe to be destroyed. That's literally what it's saying. But to put it into English, in idiomatic English, saying ought, something that ought not to happen, we have to mess with it a little bit. So another thing that ought not to have happened is liberi in servitudem abduci. Liberi means children. In the ancient world, slavery was widespread. And so within a household, you might have slave children and also free children. And so that's what liberi here means. It means free in the sense of the free children living in a household. So that's why liberi means children. It means free children as opposed to the children in the household who might be slave children. Next, we have abduki. That's the infinitive that is working here in this part of the sentence. That's ab plus duko, literally to lead away. Here, it's a passive infinitive, so it means to be led away, or to be led off, or to be carried off, something like that. So liberi plus non debuerent plus abduki says, the children did not owe to be led away, in the sense that the children ought not to have been led away. In servitutem means into slavery. That's the third declension noun servitus, and then genitive servitutus. So this part of the sentence says, the children ought not to have been led off into slavery, or led away into slavery. And we can read nostri again with liberi. So we could say our children. Notice how we've switched from third person to kind of a first person kind of thing. On line 5, we have se and meritos esse, that's third person, but then nostri means our. So now it's saying our this, our that. So kind of a strange switch from third person to first person. Anyway, next we have opida, which means towns, and then expugnari is a passive infinitive that means to be stormed. So opida plus non debuerent plus expugnari says towns did not owe to be stormed, in the sense that the towns ought not to have been stormed. So these ambassadors from the Haidui tribe, they're saying 3 things to Caesar. They're saying that we didn't deserve 3 things. We didn't deserve to have our fields destroyed. We didn't deserve for our children to be enslaved. We didn't deserve for our towns to be taken over. So apparently the Haidui are really reporting to Caesar that they've really suffered some serious trauma here from the Helvetii. Again, as I always say, we're just taking Caesar's word for it. It's his narrative, and he gets to tell the story the way he wants. Could it be that he's pulling at our heartstrings a little bit, trying to overstate what happened to try to justify the military action that he takes later? Or is it true? Did all this stuff really happen? Figuring all that out is what is called historiography, trying to work with historical sources to figure out how much value they have and what they can tell us. The goal of this lecture series is not historiography. It's really just to learn the Latin language. So we're just taking it at face value to study the language that we see here. A couple more things as we wrap up. We have in conspectu exercitus. In conspectu says in the sight. Conspectus would be a fourth declension noun. So within the field of vision of, or within the sight of. And then exercitus is genitive singular. Notice the macron over the u. That's the fourth declension noun, exercitus, which means army. And then paine means almost. So paine in conspectu exercitus says almost in the sight of the army, in the sense of the Roman army. They're saying your army is just nearby, but even though your army was nearby, you let all this terrible stuff happen to us. It's almost like they're trying to make the Romans feel guilty. You know, like, really? You let us get clobbered even though your army was right there and you could have stopped it? So the skeptical part of me thinks that this is Julius Caesar's way of justifying military action. the suspicious, skeptical reader within me thinks that that's what's going on, is he's making the narrative guide the reader toward the thought that his military actions are justified. So let's take it from line 5, Ita. We're going to throw in the word dikunt, as if dikunt is understood, they say, and then we'll need to have the word that. So we'll say this. They say that, thus they deserved at all times from the Roman people that almost in the sight of the army, that our fields ought not to have been destroyed, that our children ought not to have been led away into slavery, and that our towns ought not to have been stormed. A couple of quick notes before we go. We have some asyndeton here. It would be nice to have the word and between the word vastari and liberi. Our fields ought not to have been destroyed, and our children ought not, it would be nice to have a conjunction, but we don't have that, so we might, throw that into our translation. And again, with debuerent, we've changed things around a little bit, tense-wise, to make it into smooth English. But what I try to do here is help you see literally what it's saying, and then understand how we might massage that a little bit as we render it into English. I think that's an important part of Latin education, is to know literally what it's saying, and then the common changes that get made as you translate it into English. That was really actually kind of a difficult passage, not the easiest Latin to read. And so that's why I took a long time to sort of pick through it and go through word by word. So hopefully that helped you. And so again, that brings us to the end of yet another episode of Lenny's Latin class. Only 3 lessons left to go, 71, 72, and 73. So we'll see you again next time in lesson 71.